Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. You know, we talk a lot about war, and sometimes we accuse the American people of being asleep and not being worried like we are. We want to keep people alert to what's happening because so much devastation occurs with this constant war and spending. Yet there's a poll out recently that sort of, challenges us on that. Maybe more people are watching and concerned. I've always believed that in elections that it was important to see the difference between two candidates on who is the war candidate more warlike and who's less warlike, the peace candidates. And generally it pans out. Matter of fact, there was a article the other day that said that Hillary's one of her problems was she was seen as too much of a warmonger. And of course, Trump in his campaign, he was certainly less aggressive. And just think about the election of 64. I mean, Goldwater got destroyed by the peace candidate. You know, how many peace candidates have we had, whether it's Woodrow Wilson or FDR? They're the peace candidates, and then they create war. But that's another story. But the poll that has just come out recently says that the majority of the American people overwhelmingly are fearful of a major new war beginning. So they do have their concerns, and then it's up for discussion on where it's going to happen and who's to blame. I think that's probably the important part of our discussion.
Yeah, and this came by way, of course, by antiwar.com. We're grateful for their coverage of this. But we have a graphic up that shows this poll. It was an NBC SurveyMonkey poll done just a few days ago. And back in February, 66% of people were worried about being engaged in a major war. Now there's a huge jump, 76% from February till July. 3 in every 4 Americans are worried about being caught up in a major war. That's significant, I think.
And I think, as sad as it is, it's healthy that the people are aware of this. But I think where it becomes muddied is who's at fault and who's the war going to be with. And that's where the discussion comes up. And I think they did look into it a little bit on who is it that the American people are most worried about. It turns out they're most concerned about North Korea. And of course, that's been in the news, and there's been a lot of strong talk, from our president. And of course, the guy running North Korea is very intimidating and looks like he could do almost anything. And I think that's one of the reasons why people think, well, maybe it could be with North Korea. But major, for some reason, I don't anticipate World War III like World War II with big troops moving. Matter of fact, I hope we're smart enough not to even have a war in Korea as bad as it was in the 50s, because that was tragic, but it was still old-fashioned tanks and all. But it's still a danger spot. There's no doubt at all that is a dangerous area because the leader of North Korea is unpredictable, and our policies don't make a whole lot of sense.
They're unpredictable, too. Well, we do have that second graphic, and it does show who Americans are afraid of that we're going to war with. Who do they consider the biggest threat? If we have it up here, North Korea, 41% for all adults. It's about even across the board. Then comes ISIS. Look at Russia, interesting. All adults, only 18%. Only 18% are worried about Russia. Look at Iran. Nobody's worried about Iran. Nobody. It doesn't match the
our
news.
Government wants us to be scared,
So North Korea is the greatest threat. Why do you think that is? They must have a massive GDP. They must just...
Well, I think it's the propaganda. We always have to have an enemy, and he is a good Hitler to attack. The wealth of a nation makes a big difference. That's one of the reasons why we can still be the policemen of the world. Even though we have a fragile economy and not nearly as strong as people think, we still have wealth, and we still have the weapons, and we still have the weaponry, and we still have the reserve currency of the world. So we can buy and put on sanctions in the financial institution. We have so much control. So that's all very important. But the wealth of a nation does play a big role. So I wonder what are they like? We do remember the picture of North Korea. We know at nighttime, there's only about one light you can see, where South Korea is just bright and brilliant because it's an active state and they're wealthy and they can take care of themselves. I wished we would just turn it over to the South Koreans. But I wanted to know, just in terms of GDP, how wealthy or unwealthy the North Koreans are. So I looked at the state GDPs, because the 50 states, and the statistic I looked at listed Vermont as the state with the smallest GDP, and it was $30 billion. Not a drop in the bucket, but still, when it compares to California and Texas, which are in the trillions, we're like big countries. But I thought, well, wonder what North Korea, they have 16. So our poor state has twice the wealth and the productivity as North Korea. And people, and all this going back and forth, it has to be war propaganda. And I think the most real thing, though, is not that North Korea is going to get a nuclear weapon and they're going to launch it here. That sounds like Iraq propaganda.
Yeah.
But there's conventional weapons there. They have nothing else. All their money is in a bunch of weapons that are targeted to Seoul. And that's not too far away, and that does pose a real threat. But it's still, I think the war propaganda on our part, because quite frankly, I just think we ought to be out of there. We've said that so long, and compared it to us getting out of Vietnam, what a difference. And the thing of it is, I think we're closer to the South Vietnamese government's position. They would at least, they're offering to talk and do less militarism and not have our troops going through these exercises and all. But anyway, the American people rightfully should be concerned about the war in the various parts of the world, but I'm not so sure that there would be much problems with North Korea if we weren't involved.
Yeah, and all those missiles aimed towards Seoul are kind of a mutually assured destruction between the two Koreas. It's almost an insurance policy. It can almost be viewed as a defensive move. But, the media, I think, has to be given a lot of guilt in this role, because every time they fire something off, it's an ICBM, it could hit you in your home. They really ramp up the fear. And I just saw a U.S. general say the other day that he doesn't think this missile could have even gone as far as they say. It just fizzles. But here's what the media doesn't report, or certainly underreports. Just 2 days ago, the new South Korean president, Moon Jae-in, he proposed, you probably read this, he proposed military-to-military talks right on the DMZ. Let's get together and talk about ramping down the tension. He also said he's ready to meet Kim Jong-un, quote, any place, anytime. That's a big shift. And you talked about the proposal that China and Russia proposed, that the U.S. and South Korea stop with these exercises, North Korea knock it off with the missile tests, and that seems like a pretty good start.
You wonder where the pressure comes from, because Trump did convince a lot of people, and we were sympathetic to his less aggressive foreign policy, especially with Russia and all. But all of a sudden, the pressure comes, and it hasn't let up. It's constant. And it's the media, that does it too. Now, you wonder why the administration capitulates on this and doesn't look at this more objectively. What is it that makes us assume that we are so much smarter and we know what South Korea ought to do?
Yeah.
And I thought Pat Buchanan had a great editorial on this the other day, and he said, get out of there, and if South Korea thinks they need a nuclear weapon to protect themselves, let them pay for it, So I think that, and South Korea, now you talk about GDP and all, I didn't look up South Korea, but I bet it's probably bigger than half our states.
Yeah.
It's a significant country. So I just don't think as nutty as UN is, I just don't think that, I think it's grandstanding, but it fits into our propaganda, because maybe, our media people and our neocons, they never admit, oh yeah, we like war. I remember one time on the House floor when I said something like, I think neocons love war, and that was over the top. So he just furious about that. So they probably don't love war. They probably think just inching up to a war
Yeah.
can do it. But here, it looks like they've convinced the American people that they're inching up too close, and there's reason for concern. The other thing that I think about when I worry about wars breaking out, the foreign policy, which we talk about all the time, that's a reason for us to have so many conflicts. But what about this whole principle of when countries get into trouble financially and economically? It's the most common thing, a distraction. Unifies the people, brings the people together, and they start wars over that. So that is another reason why I think that we have to be concerned. But overall, the overriding issue is the interventionist foreign policy, and that's what I wish they would address.
Yeah, we had a piece up at the Ron Paul Institute website about how we're sort of sleepwalking into a war with Iran, which is another one of those countries we're terrified of, 1% of the people. But it's an interesting concept, this piece that we ran, because he's talking about, on the one hand, ISIS is on the ropes. There's no question about it. So if that's the case over here, then why has the president asked Congress for permission to build a bunch of new military bases in Iraq and Syria? If you'd almost think that we'd be pulling out if they're on the ropes. So he suggested, and it's actually something that you said, that a good little war unites the people. And I think the neocon propaganda always is, this will be a breeze, this will be a cakewalk, we'll take Iran out immediately, no problem. And it seems like that's where things are heading.
I think the plan is to put 8 bases in Syria, but they haven't yet asked the government of Syria. And right now, the government of Syria is backed up by Russia. So there's lots of problems there. But it just seems like we go on our ways to provoke. And I think that's what we do with Iran. We've been doing that for a long time, since 1953. We've been doing this. So we get together, some nations from Europe get together, and the 5 nations that got together, and they worked out an agreement with Iran. You say, they won't live up to it, and the neocons said, don't trust them, don't trust them. Guess what? Every time they get an inspection, they're living up to it, and they just had an inspection.
Yeah.
And our government announced they passed the test. They're not messing around with nukes. So what do we do the next day? We say, we got to put on more sanctions because they're thinking about it. They might do it. And they go into this. And I kept thinking that all this fear of a nuke, whether it's North Korea or fear of Iran, is the fear of a nuclear doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And they're not on the verge of it. They're not on, even if they had it, they'd probably treat it like India and Pakistan does. Nobody sits around and wonders when Pakistan and India is going to have a nuclear war. It's never even talked about anymore. But they don't have it. They pass the test, and then we still want to do it. Now, the Iranians, what their assessment was? He's just trying to provoke us to do something dumb.
I'm sure that's what it is.
And of course, we have done that before. Sort of World War II got doing that, how we provoked, the Japanese. And then after the provoking worked, then it was all over.
Yeah.
There was no argument about who the bad guys were.
And here's what Washington said: Iran, quote, won't go unpunished, end quote, for, quote, violating the spirit of the agreement. So as if this agreement is some sort of a spiritual thing. They violated the spirit.
I think the spirit of something is sort of subjective.
Yeah.
Who's going to describe the spirit that's involved? So,
but the U.S. is the one that's been in constant violation of the agreement. They're trying to block U.S. companies from doing business with Iran. They're trying to keep these sanctions on, or the sanctions were supposed to be eased if Iran was shown to be, living up to the rules. But what's interesting, I think, about this, and this is what makes me worried a little bit about war with Iran. I don't think Europe is going to go along if the U.S. rips up the agreement. I was looking at some stats. There's been a 78% increase in Iran-EU trade in 2016. So this agreement is producing a lot of economic activity to the benefit of both sides. I don't think they're going to want to go back to the old days where they're going to lose this trade revenue.
And there's a lot of conflict over there, and the major conflict that we're in the middle of unnecessarily is the conflict between the Shia and the Sunnis, Saudi and the Iranians. Now, that might get hotter too, but if I argue and take the place, well, that's not our business. We shouldn't be involved. They break it out, let them be. But the whole thing is we are very much involved. If that gets out of hand, that's going to be, significantly affect us. But right now, it's pretty fascinating that the American people are keeping an eye on this. It is interesting, though, that they don't seem to worry about Iran. Once again, I think it was the media that helped direct the hostility. It's a lot easier to direct the hostility toward North Korea.
Well, I guess if I can close it down a little bit from my perspective, I would say we should be happy that Americans are worried about war. They should be worried about war. The thing that I would tell them, if you, 3/4 of you out there are like us and you worry about war, the number one thing is don't listen to the war propagandists. They will lie us into a war. Whenever you hear them, CNN, all the other fake news, plug your ears, read something else, watch the Liberty Report, read the Liberty Report, read the Ron Paul Institute.
But I think the hardest thing to do is to look at ourselves and see ourselves as we really are. It's patriotic not to ever criticize our own government. I happen to believe patriotism is the willingness to criticize the government when they're wrong. And it would be nice to think that we are holier than thou and that we have rescued so many people and that our wars have always been well-intentioned and they've done a lot of good. But if you look at our total history from the very beginning, probably about 95% of every year, there was some type of war going on. If you counted all the Indian wars and all the little wars in Central America, and especially in the 20th century with the beginning of the Spanish-American War, I mean, there has been activities right now. So even though they're constant, the nature has changed from the 20th century. We're not having World War I and World War II, but we are a warring type of nation, and people see this as a moral responsibility on our part because other people are so foolish as to fight and they can't settle their disputes. Well, I would take the position that it's our interference there, our mess in there, our presence in South Korea, which has made things worse there. And I think that we make the Middle East, obviously, it should be clear to everybody that we have not helped the Middle East. And if you ever add up the number of people, the civilians killed, the militant people killed, and how people have been incentivized to come and do harm to us, I mean, the evidence is so strong. Of course, I think the evidence is overwhelmingly strong that the way we manage our economy with Keynesianism and central banking, people should wake up, and they're going to, because our economic system can't continue to find these very expensive wars. And just remember, in recent history, the Soviet system came down for economic reason. They had a failed system, and they no longer could afford it, and their military approach, just totally faded away. So that will happen to us, but this is an opening, and it's been an opening. The people really don't like war. It's only when they feel guilty if they don't support war that they're unpatriotic. And of course, that was the accusation toward me, that because I didn't support the wars in the Middle East, for some reason I was un-American, against the troops, and unpatriotic. But I think we need a new sense of what true patriotism might be about. And quite frankly, it's about what we promote in our foundation, the Foundation for Peace and Prosperity. We want to promote peace and prosperity. It's available to us with just a little bit more common sense and a little more integrity and a little bit of sense of morality on how we treat people. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.